Okay, so I mean that kind of leads us to the next question, which involves the international reaction to that, to well, what the international reaction may be to this coup, what characterizes how the international community is going to react to a particular coup, and I don't know, maybe most interesting to me is what the effect of an international reaction to a coup is. So, I guess starting at the top, what generally characterizes what the international consensus, the international reaction to a coup is going to look like, to a coup like we've seen in Egypt and twice in the last 2 years.
All right, this is messy, Rob, because we don't know a whole lot about this. I'll tell you where we're at in this sort of research. We're in the infancy of all coup research. I'm not gonna lie to you. When we're talking about empirical, large N research, what happens to a whole bunch of cases over time. At this point, me and a co-author, Megan Shannon from Florida State, and a couple undergrads, we've coded all international responses to all successful coups since 1950. And we've just started putting together some papers on this. We have a forthcoming paper that we just look at what predicts whether or not states will respond. So, states and IOs. So half of coups since 1950, there hasn't been a word said about them. Right? The coup happens, they get reported, and then nobody reacts at all. So, like I said, most people ignore these things. Most states ignore these things. Now, as far as what we know, when do states respond? Well, states respond if the coup happens in a rich state. They've responded a whole lot more recently. So at the end of the Cold War and beyond, when kind of these laws started to be written, these anti-coup laws started to be written. Beyond that, we don't know a whole heck of a lot. So as far as peer-reviewed published articles. Now, I'll tell you what a paper I'm working on right now, and I'm pretty close to getting it submitted to a journal. I think it's solid enough that I feel ethical telling you about it. What I've found is that, so deep in a variable, I'm looking at the tenure of leaders following a coup. So when you overthrow the government, you're in charge, how long do you last? And what I've found really pretty solid findings is that the international community is one of the best predictors of whether or not you'll remain in power. So if you overthrow the government and the international community is silent or they show support for you, then you're going to be in power for pretty much as long as you want to be in power, right? But if you come into power and the international community condemns you very, very harshly, then your time is limited. You're going to be either overthrown, you're going to call elections very quickly before you're overthrown. This pressure is going to cause you to do something, whether it's your choosing or not. How the international community responds is just really critical to whether or not you're going to stay in power. So I think that's pretty exciting finding, and I'm pretty eager to get out there. So many people said with the Arab Spring, stay out of it, Obama. It's not about us, it's about them. We ought to just watch this thing happen. Maybe, maybe not, but whatever we do, it's going to matter. Even if it's silence, that's going to matter.
Now, so this is really interesting to me in the context of the February 2011 coup. I mean, and obviously, I haven't read your manuscript, and so I don't know how you're handling it. I mean, but it seems to me that the reaction to Mubarak's ouster was pretty positive on the part of the international community, wasn't? I mean, so shouldn't that suggest that Morsi should have lasted longer than he did, or is there an intervening variable? Because Morsi himself, of course, became very unpopular very quickly with the international community. And I guess Morsi shouldn't really be termed as the one who carried out the coup. But so how do we understand Egypt in context of this finding? How do we understand the 2011 coup in context of this finding?
Well, first of all, so the reactions were primarily negative. Including the United States. So Daniel Morey is a professor here in our department, and me and a couple of undergrads. We focus specifically on how states signaled to the Arabs during the Arab Spring uprising, because we're interested in this question, right? So we have a paper in Social Science Quarterly that kind of plots the trajectory of responses by international actors, trying to analyze essentially, was Obama a leader, follower, or whatever, compared to other states. And we waffled a little bit, but primarily it was a negative response to the coup. One thing that's not surprising is that the military leaders were pretty quick to put somebody else in charge, right? That's what we'd expect. And then, from that point on, the second coup, the one that just happened a few days ago, I mean, the reason why that one's not surprising isn't so much the international community, it's just that coups lead to coups. And the economy is in shambles in Egypt. So just those two factors alone make it not that surprising that the coup happened in Egypt. So I don't think there's too much of a puzzle based on how responses were to 2011.
Okay, all right. And so then, and you do have this paper about Obama leadership, and so what you would suggest, at least sort of in policy, and moving forward in policy terms, is that the success of what the successor regime in Egypt is going to be is going to depend a lot on, sort of what the United States specifically does, or is it going to be like how much? Because I know Saudi Arabia has already expressed some degree of support for the coup. So is it going to be primarily the United States? So hegemonic actors? Is it local and regional actors? Is it international organizations that are going to really matter for whether this current regime can endure for some substantial amount of time?
I'll tell you what I know, and then I'll tell you what I think.
Okay.
What I know is that both signals from states and international organizations have a significant impact. They both matter. So, especially if they're alongside each other, which they usually are, the IOs and states, if they all come out in huge condemnation of this coup that happened a few days ago, I expect the regime to change very, very quickly. Right? They're gonna go back to elections very, very quickly. So it doesn't really depend on there. Now, as far as does it matter if it's only the United States? I don't have evidence on that. I think that the best guess would be, it's mostly the United States, just because that's where the bulk of the aid comes from. So it would make a lot of sense that our signal matters more than anybody else's signal when it comes to Egypt.
Right. And so that's what you know. So what is it that you think? Or was that both what you know and what you think?
The U.S. part's what I think.
Okay.
I'd have to interact that signal with aid. I've done that with predicting whether or not another coup will happen, right? So how do external actors predict that a coup happens? Now, as far as predicting what happens after that coup, I don't know. I could run my analyses real quick and figure it out while we're talking if you want, but that might be kind of distracting.
No, that's fine. It would probably actually slow down the recording so much that we wouldn't be able to move on. So, I mean, you talked a little bit about, and I think this is going to be really interesting to a lot of the audience. You talked a little bit about Obama's reaction and Obama's leadership or lack thereof. I mean, just from casually glancing over the abstract to your leader-follower paper, your argument seems to be that really the United States is not exerting much of a leadership role here regionally and with respect to Egypt, but that such a role might be consequential. So I guess what would... I guess first, maybe you can characterize sort of why you think that it's been a very sort of weak role that the Obama administration has followed, and what would a much stronger role really look like, right? If we had some other administration conduct, what other policies would we sort of be able to come back and say these were really strong policies in favor of the successor regime after February 2011, or in favor of this next successor regime now?
All right. I mean, so I think it's true that Obama hasn't been a huge leader. Our analyses support that. Now, why? I think there's two pretty good reasons to explain that. One is that there are a lot of countries that don't want our leadership. So if we speak for one thing, we're going to get the opposite. So sometimes the best thing to do to make sure we don't have that sort of backlash is just to shut up and let things play out, which is tough to do, but we come out in support of a certain individual, in a whole lot of countries, and that's the best way to kill that individual's chance of getting the job, right? The second one is just, I think, Obama's outlook on foreign policy. It's tough to define an Obama doctrine because he just doesn't have this kind of one-size-fits-all approach, this, like the Bush doctrine, where the idea we fight terrorism, we push democracy everywhere because we believe so much in democracy. I mean, that's just not Obama's gig. It's not that I think he hates democracy, but the idea is that we approach each new event individually. We don't have some overarching principle that's going to guide everything, and so when things happen very rapidly, you can't just go to your playbook and say, okay, we have a coup, our doctrine says to condemn this right now, we condemn it that afternoon, right? That's just not how he leads.
Right.
So, had a different administration been in power, it's tough. The Arab Spring was a big deal. Lots of countries all at once. My guess would be, if Bush had been in power, he would have gone to his doctrine that says we push democracy as hard as we can everywhere. We believe in it, and we're going to support democracy. We're going to support the coup that overthrew Mubarak right away. We're going to try to push elections as quickly as possible. I don't know what you think about that.
Right.
U.S. foreign policy better than I do, buddy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, I try to, I guess, one of the lenses I try to see it through, because it's not, we take a Bush regime off the table, right, and we say, well, what might a McCain administration have done, or what might a Romney administration have done? And I think McCain just came out yesterday and came out in favor of cutting off military aid to the Egyptian military, which is, to my recollection, the primary form of aid that we give to Egypt, something like $1.3 billion per year in this long-running deal we have to pay the Israelis and the Egyptians not to fight each other. And I guess I just don't know how to categorize analytically what that would mean, right? I mean, what does it mean to say that we are cutting off aid to the Egyptian military? How do you approach that question from, is this a pro-democratic or an anti-democratic move? Because I can see either ors on both sides. That this was that of course, as you suggested earlier, there were plenty of reasons to suggest that what we had here was really an illiberal democracy, and that not necessarily the democratic thing was to end the regime, but on the other hand, this is clearly and obviously a military coup, right? And military coups against democratically elected leaders, as you suggest, don't tend to work out. And so we ought to then send this costly signal to the Egyptian military that we don't approve of this kind of behavior. But then, at the same time, I'm not sure how you reassemble that egg, right? At what point can you say, well, we will resume this level of military aid, which is really sort of a regional stabilization move more than anything else, if the Egyptian military does something in particular. And I'm not sure what exactly that thing in particular would be, right? Whether there's sort of more another set of elections and a robust, sincere promise not to throw out this particular democratically elected leader.
Yeah, I mean.
So I guess I'm not sure. I just don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, you bring up two awesome points. I mean, the misconception people have about the aid to Egypt is pretty big. Right? It's not because we love them and we care about a strong military. You're right. It's about regional stabilization, right? As much about Israel is, well, probably more about Israel than it is about Egypt.
Since the fall of the Soviet Union, I think the need to draw Egypt into our orbit has dropped dramatically. So, anyway, you were saying?
I forget what my second point. I liked what you said, though.
Right. I do think I really like how you characterized sort of the case by case way that the Obama administration seems to approach, and I think the phrase that a lot of people use, and the phrase which is borrowed from social science from way back when, from Charles Lindblom, is muddling through. Is that And people use this both negatively and positively in reference to the Obama administration, that the Obama administration is really determined to muddle through rather than sort of create a set of root principles. And there are significant pluses and minuses to embracing a muddling through approach to strategy. But whatever they may be, the Obama administration has pretty clearly embraced a let's muddle through approach to foreign policy. And yeah, I mean, I have not the faintest notion of what's going to happen next. I guess, sort of put all cards on the table, one of the things I'm most, and I wouldn't say perplexed or even surprised, fascinated by with respect to this particular event is how reluctant, or the degree to which Egyptian liberals have embraced this coup, have embraced this action. And I'll just refer to my Facebook feed where, people who normally sort of hate authoritarian rulership, especially in Arab states, think that this is just fabulous, right? And I'm like, it could not work out. It's a military coup, really. I mean, sometimes they don't work out. Most of the time, they don't work out. So,
yeah, I mean,
I don't know. It's fascinating stuff.
What John and I wrote about in our paper, it's just that if you see the trajectory of where Morsi was headed, I don't think it was going to get better anytime soon, right? I mean, he did about all he could to become authoritarian in a year that he could. He did all he could to incite what happened to him. Not all that surprising that the coup happened, and it was against a guy that was headed in a very illiberal direction. So it's not all that shocking that we'd see people support this. And I remember when 2011 happened, listening to Sean Hannity on the radio saying how the Muslim Brotherhood was going to take charge and they were going to push their hardcore Islamic ideals. And I hate to say it, but he was kind of right. Morsi was better than I expected he'd be, but he was still bad. So you can see some happiness coming out of this, or at least better than they were headed. There's at least some sort of hope, I think.
Right. I mean, I worry. I guess my most substantial worry is that people in Egypt are, and the protesters in the streets of Cairo are. They are operating with a biased sample about what the people of Egypt really think about Morsi and really think about the Muslim Brotherhood. And just because all of their friends hated Morsi and all of their friends hated the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't actually mean that there wasn't some degree of support, especially in rural Egypt and especially outside of Cairo, for the Muslim Brotherhood. And that we're going to see more events like we saw this morning, right? And that they're going to get worse and worse with the gunning down of 53 some protesters or something along those lines this morning. I don't know. So
go
ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, one thing that is pretty scary is this idea of what comes next. So you would think that my guess would be that the U.S. is going to say that, we're going to cut off aid until you hold elections or something like that, right? And the military is going to say, okay, we'll hold elections, but in some way we're going to exclude or outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood. All right, so you're right. There's a broad base of support for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So what recourse do they have? Now, a civil war, maybe, but the military is so strong, I would suspect not. Thus, your one remaining way to fight back is terrorism. We've already seen what a couple of natural gas pipelines blow up in the Sinai, the desert in the Sinai Peninsula. So that's my prediction. I mean, what we're going to see in 2 years is a democratically elected government, Muslim Brotherhood unable to run, and a whole bunch of stuff blowing up every now and then in Egypt.
Right, and perhaps specifically the targeting of Westerners and Western interests in Egypt. Right, I mean, this is not a time that I would be scheduling my trip to. I mean, and I hate to say this because the Egyptian economy really depends on tourist dollars in a lot of important ways. This is just fundamentally not a time. Kanye and Kim, if you were planning on getting married in Egypt, just don't. Right? It's just not a good idea.
No,
to do right
nobody
now.
should be traveling to Egypt right now.
Right? No. I think Westerners are going to be targeted. I mean, so last question, and this is really going out on a limb, but you know, and you can tell us both what you know and both what you think. You've said what Egypt looks like in 2 years. What do you think Egypt looks like in 10 years? In terms of what the government looks like and sort of the state of stability looks like, or the stability of the state looks like in Egypt?
Well, I can tell you I don't know anything. I mean, that's a long way off to be able to cite literature that gives you any accurate estimation. I'm going to give you a guess. I think they'll have things figured out by then. I would guess it would be a democracy, a rough democracy, a fledgling democracy, plenty of kinks to work out. But the thing is that their economy is so dependent, like you said, on tourism, that they're going to have stability very, very quickly. I think people realize that. One way to do that is just the military takes over. They're the strong men. They do it clear back to Mubarak days. I don't think the people are going to stand for that. So my guess would be that eventually they're going to get this democracy thing to work out. Now, that being said, that's a really stupid guess. It's a really optimistic guess. If I just do my best with what the literature is going to tell us, I wouldn't say civil war. The military is too strong. I would say an authoritarian regime. It's tough to make democracy stick after such a long time with authoritarianism.
Yeah. All right, Clay. Well, this has been a hell of a lot of fun, and we should do this again. The next time there's a coup in some interesting country. That's actually the most fabulous point about not talking. I mean, area specialists are interesting until you're talking about an area, right? But non-area specialists also, you talk about general events, and general events happen all the time, right? I mean, maybe the next coup will be less interesting unless it's in Canada or something, but which would in fact be very interesting. So,
well, it's been fun, buddy. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for being on, and thank you, Foreign Entanglements viewers.